Okay, let's have a short introduction to the institutional design literature. When we say institutional, it's because of institutions. And institutions are rules that influence the strategies of state and social actors. Rules that we are interested in are formal rules. Formal because they are written down. In fact, for one major institutionalist, political science professor, they're written down somewhere as laws, regulations, constitutions, treaties, and so forth. And poetically, Professor Kari calls them as parchment institutions. Okay? This would be the work of Professor Kari, parchment, equilibria, and institutions. Okay? And the meta-institution par excellence. Meta-institution in the sense that these are institutions that create other institutions would be, of course, the Constitution. Institutional design basically would be differences in the arrangement of formal rules. One basic example would be the form of government. Form of government would be understood in the political science discipline as the relation between the executive and the legislative. And we call this a horizontal relationship. The institutional design of a country's form of government, if separated, would be presidential, if fused, parliamentary, and if hybrid, semi-presidential, with all its variations. The institutional design literature, as mentioned earlier in the introduction, studies how the design or redesign of a country's political institutions, such as the form of government, system of government, electoral system, party system, legislative structure, judicial system, and constitutional bodies, affects or will affect, among others, the accountability, representation, popular empowerment, elite capture, and coherent policy making of the state. The institutional design literature is also known or termed as constitutional engineering literature if it's about the Constitution, constitutional design literature, or simply institutional approach, or new institutionalism. The institutional design literature counts some of the biggest names in the political science discipline. Today's lecture would recruit supporting arguments from, among others, John Kerry, whom we already met, Matthew Sugar, Scott Mainwaring, Robert Kaufman, George Chivelis, Giovanni Sartori, and Stefan Haggard. We're also going to discuss winners of the Johann Skype Prize in Political Science. Think of it as our Nobel Prize in Political Science. And this prize is given to the scholar who, in the view of the foundation, has made the most valuable contribution to political science. So, Aaron Leiphart would be discussed. He got the award 1997. Rain Tagepera in 2008. Adam Zborsky. And the most recent winner, Jon Elster, just this month, October 2016, as the most recent winner. We're also going to mention Juan Lins, who won the award in 1996, but in a critical light. So let us now go to what is federalism. This section might take something like 20 minutes, and it's an introduction on what federalism is, a basic introduction. The most famous definition of federalism is actually the shortest one. It is by an Israeli political science professor who taught in Temple University in Pennsylvania, Daniel Elazar, in his 1987 book, Exploring Federalism. The book. According to him, the simplest possible definition is self-rule plus shared rule. For people who have already read on federalism, this italicized part, self-rule plus shared rule, is repeated like a mantra in most discussion of federalism. And it actually came from Professor Elazar. And from this definition, you have this concept of divided powers, and shared sovereignty. Another famous definition of federalism is from another political science professor, one of the pioneers of game theory in the United States, William Riker. In his 1975 article, a classic article, Federalism, in Volume 5 of Handbook of Political Science. According to him, federalism is a political organization in which the activities of government are divided between regional governments and a central government in such a way that each kind of government has some activities in which it makes final decisions. The achievement of this definition is to identify jurisdiction, and jurisdiction in at least one area for one kind of government. A current definition of federalism, quite popular right now in Philippine circles, is the one we could get from the primer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, a 2015 primer, Federalism. And according to this primer, federalism is a system of government that establishes a constitutionally specified division of powers between different levels of government. The achievement is to identify the Constitution as very important in identifying division of powers. And I'm using this definition because it mentions system of government, because we could discuss it now. In political science, when we speak of system of government, it's a relationship between the central government and the local government. If the presidential and parliamentary form would be horizontal relations, this one would be understood as a vertical one. And we're basically seeing in diagram a unitary system of government, wherein the central government is the single source of authority and the local government is subordinate to the central. In certain policy areas, if it's a federal system of government, in certain policy areas where central government has exclusive jurisdiction, the diagram still applies. We need not change the drawing. So central government could still be seen as taking precedence over local government. But in certain areas where local government has exclusive jurisdiction, local government could be seen as taking precedence over central government. In certain policy areas where both governments have jurisdiction, identified as concurrent or shared, we could diagram this as central government and local government. Okay, so let us now go to the list of federal countries. The Handbook of Federal Countries in 2005, this is the 2005 book, listed 25 federal countries. So these are the 25 federal countries. The Forum of Federations in October 26 to update our list, lists 24 federal countries. It has added in the list Iraq, Nepal, and Sudan. But interestingly, it has taken out Comoros, the Federated States of Micronesia, and St. Kitts and Nevis, which are still federal countries. So if we add the three taken out, my provisional list would be 27. There are 27 federal states. These 25 federal states cover 40% of the world's population. But in terms of numbers, they constitute a minority of the total of 195 states. In terms of institutional features, so we move down to the institutional features of federal system. This section is mainly based on Ronald Watts' 1996 book, Comparing Federal Systems in the 1990s. Ronald Watts is one of the most popular and important scholar on federalism, and the book Comparing Federal Systems in the 1990s is one of his most popular works. It is one of the most useful also because it gives a cogent introduction in just about 150 pages of what federalism is. Many texts in the slides are direct quotes from this book. I did not rewrite many of his terms because of the technical nature of his arguments. I'm also going to use Ateneo's Federalism and an article from the Oxford Handbook of Political Institutions, an article from Brian Galligan, a professor of political science from University of Melbourne, on comparative federalism. So the 6 common institutional features of federal system according to Watts. Different scholars list different numbers of common or essential features of federalism. Watts lists 6 common features. Galligan lists 4. An older scholar, Ivo Duchesek, actually, that's his work, worked in 1971, a political science professor from the City University of New York, lists 8, and he actually calls them as yardsticks of federalism. So we go now to Watts. The first one would be orders of government. The first feature would be 2 orders of government, each acting directly on on their citizens. These 2 orders of government, the first would be the federal level, aka also known as federal, US, Germany, central, South Africa, union government, India, national, Sudan, and the second level would be the constituent level, also known as states in Australia, Malaysia, the United States, provinces, Argentina, Canada, regions, Belgium, cantons, Switzerland, autonomous communities, Spain, Länder, Austria, and Germany. Except for the communities constituent unit of Belgium in terms of linguistic communities, all are actually geographically or territorially defined. And we have a map of the federal states of Germany, where you're going to see that all 16 Länder geographically defined. Let's go now to distribution of powers. This is the longest section. It will take probably about 10 minutes. And the second feature would be a formal constitutional distribution of powers and allocation of revenue resources within the 2 orders of government. So, distribution of powers could be understood also as jurisdiction, also known as legislative competences. This distribution of power involves the distribution of legislative powers and executive powers between the federal and constituent governments. Okay? By legislative powers, they could vary in terms of form and scope. By form, this would be exclusive legislative powers, or concurrent legislative powers, or residual legislative powers. We're going to define each of them later. By scope, let me go first to scope. By scope, okay, this would be basically your policy areas. Defense, taxing powers, immigration, social affairs, international affairs, interregional transportation, economic and monetary union, maintenance of law, and security. So let us now go to form. Let us discuss exclusive legislative powers. Exclusive legislative powers are assigned only to either the federal government. Examples would be Canada, Spain, India, Australia, US, Argentina, and Pakistan, or the constituent government. Examples: Canada, Spain, and India. Canada's constitution would be a very good example because it identifies jurisdictions that are exclusively federal, and an example of the jurisdiction there, and exclusively provincial. Concurrent legislative powers, on the other hand, are shared between the federal and the constituent governments. They're shared, therefore they're also called shared legislative powers. Okay? May be legislated by both the federal and the constituent governments. In case of conflicts between them, In most instances, federal legislation prevails over constituent legislation. Examples of countries with extensive areas of concurrent jurisdiction would be Australia, Germany, India, the United States. An example of a country with limited areas of concurrent jurisdiction would be Canada, largely because it has identified many of its policy areas in terms of exclusively federal or exclusively constituent. Residual legislative powers identify which order of government has jurisdiction over matters not specified in the Constitution as exclusive or concurrent. Okay. This jurisdiction could be given to federal government, usually in federations created by the process of devolution from a formerly unitary state. And this is called in the literature as holding together federalism. Examples given by what would be India and Canada, or given to constituent governments. Usually in federations created by the process of aggregating previously separate units, identified in the literature as coming together federalism. And examples would be Australia, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and the United States. We have a useful table of distribution of powers in a sample of federal countries from Ateneo. If you would see on foreign affairs and defense, they're all federal, exclusively federal in jurisdiction. But when it comes to on police matters, you now have a distinction. For example, Australia, from federal defense becomes shared, similar to Canada. Pakistan from federal to units. Okay. So you see the difference there. In terms of criminal justice, again a variation of jurisdiction. But compare this to civil justice, you would have a shift. For example, Canada, units for criminal justice becomes shared for civil justice. For Nigeria, shared for criminal justice becomes units for civil justice. One example also is primary education. And then with universities, you would see a shift. Australia and Nigeria, from units on primary, become shared on universities. And South Africa, from shared, becomes central. On health and welfare, social security, you would see that there's a difference, a variation in the 6 countries. Come hospitals from federal. In Australia, it become units. In Canada, the reverse happens, to a certain extent. Units become shared. Nigeria, unspecified to shared. And then South Africa, central to shared. You might have noticed here that Malaysia all federal. And this explains to a certain extent why Malaysia is considered as one of the most centralized of all federal systems. When we go to trade and industry, this will be mostly concurrent or shared in the Ateneo language, with South Africa being exclusively central. And you would have tourism as shared for all. We could now go again to distribution of powers, and I would like to discuss a very important point because it's quite popular right now in the discussion, in the debate on federalism. And it's about symmetrical distribution of powers and asymmetrical. By symmetrical, all constituent governments have equal juridical status and powers. Asymmetrical would be one form of which would be constitutional asymmetry. There's another one, political asymmetry. Constitutional asymmetry would be differences in the status of legislative and executive powers assigned by the Constitution to the constituent governments. One type of constitutional symmetry would be the increase in the jurisdiction or autonomy of particular constituent states. For example, concessions made to the Borneo states, Sabah and Sarawak, when they joined the Malaysian Federation in 1963. Another example would be concessions made to some of the autonomous communities in Spain, especially the Basque Country, Catalonia, and Galicia. In terms of allocation of revenue resources, this would be composed of two things: tax collection and revenue-raising powers, and intergovernmental financial transfers. Together, they are known as fiscal federalism. We could discuss first tax collection and revenue-raising powers. And we have a distribution of taxing powers. We did not go through this in detail. The point is that in terms of customs, okay, you will see that they would be mostly exclusively federal, with Belgium the only concurrent. Federal paramountcy simply means that if there would be any conflict, it would be the federal that would take priority. So similar to excise tax, it's also mostly exclusively federal, with US and Belgium being concurrent. You have corporate income tax now becoming different. More countries, they are still federal, but you would have an increase in countries becoming concurrent. Canada also purely concurrent. As well as personal income, the same thing happens, but you would notice that concurrent now has more countries in that column. In terms of foreign borrowing, 3 countries are exclusively federal, 1 concurrent, but more are concurrent. And domestic borrowing, mostly concurrent. In terms of, okay, so we now go to intergovernmental financial transfers. Okay, this will be known as equalization transfers or solidarity transfers. And they are composed of conditional and unconditional grants. Think of them as roughly similar to the Philippines' internal revenue allotment. Fiscal imbalances that every federalism has to correct, according to Watts, would be vertical imbalances. Okay, and these are constitutionally assigned revenue. This happened because constitutionally assigned revenues for the federal and constituent governments are not in sync with the constitutionally assigned expenditure responsibilities for the federal and constituent governments. The explanation of what's here, okay, the main reason for the vertical imbalance would be that the allocation of major taxing powers to the federal government, you might have noticed that most taxing powers were given exclusively to federal, okay, versus the assignment of expenditures to the constituent governments, for example, health or education. Horizontal imbalances happen because revenue capacities of different constituent governments vary, and this results in the inability of constituent governments to provide their citizens with services at the same level. This would be understood as regional imbalances. Correcting the horizontal and vertical imbalances would be financial transfers from one level of government to another. You have federal governments, constituent governments, and financial transfers happening here. One exception is Germany, which engages in interstate transfers. And financial transfers could be conditional, and wherein federal transfers to constituent governments that have conditions attached to them. Or unconditional transfers, wherein federal transfers to constituent governments that have no conditions attached to them. Let's go to the third institutional feature, bicameralism. The third feature for Watts would be the provision for the designated representation of distinct regional views within the federal policymaking institutions, usually provided by the particular form of the federal second chamber. The second chamber would be the principle of bicameralism in federalism. um, except the United Arab Emirates and St. Kitts and Nevis, all federations are bicameral. Okay? And these two countries actually prove the rule because they are not, okay? They do not undermine the argument. United Arab Emirates is actually an authoritarian regime. St. Kitts is a microstate whose population is just 1/4 of the biggest population of the barangay in Quezon City, Barangay Commonwealth. So bicameralism, the most important aspect would be the second chamber, because according to Watts, unlike the first chamber, the second chamber is the legislative institution which operates on the basis of representation as states. Okay? So this is this distinct regional views within the federal policy-making institutions. The fourth institutional feature would be constitutional entrenchment. The fourth feature would be a supreme written constitution not unilaterally amendable and requiring the consent of a significant proportion of the constituent units. Not unilaterally amendable. This is the principle of constitutional entrenchment of federalism, or in plain English, very difficult to amend its federal character. Amendments of the Constitution that affect its federal character, for example, the distribution of power, require the involvement of both orders of government in federalism. Most federations require approval in both houses of the federal legislature. For some countries, simple majority, like Switzerland and Canada, or absolute majority, Australia, or special majority, US, India, and Canada. Plus, approval either by a special majority of the constituent unit legislature, for example, US, Canada, India, and Malaysia. For example, in the US, you need 3/4 approval of the constituent states, and that would be 38 of the legislatures of the 50 states in the United States. Or by a referendum requiring a quote-unquote double majority. Double majority is also known as federally weighted, and this is composed by the first one, an overall majority of the population, and majorities in a majority of constituent units. And Switzerland and Australia have this. I would like to qualify Watts. Remember the first slide that I showed on constitutional entrenchment. Some federal constitutions actually have eternity clauses for their federal character. By eternity clauses, this would mean that clauses cannot be changed by amendment. There is forever in federalism. For example, Brazil and Germany have clauses wherein you could not change their federal character. So we have to modify this, not just simply very difficult, but in certain cases not possible to revoke. This is very important for us to understand, and I will emphasize this later once we discuss institutional design. The fifth would be adjudication. The fifth feature would be an umpire in the form of courts or provision for referendums to rule on disputes between governments. So, an umpire to rule on disputes between governments, even more necessary in federations than in unitary governments. Okay? Because of the unavoidability of overlaps of jurisdiction between governments, and the consequent likelihood of intergovernmental competition and conflict, and the need for processes to adjudicate disputes and resolve conflicts. In one country, this is through referendum, and that would be Switzerland. But in most cases, it is through the judiciary. That's why the criticism by some scholars of the judicialization of politics in a federal system, because court cases, a lot of court cases are on the jurisdiction, on who has jurisdiction between the federal and the constituent government. In terms of courts, there are two types of courts in a federal system. There could be a Supreme Court, the final adjudicator in relation to all courts, including the Constitution, similar to our Supreme Court. And the examples here would be the United States, Canada, Australia, India, Malaysia, and Austria, or a constitutional court in a federal system, as well as in a parliamentary system, which specializes in constitutional interpretation, especially on jurisdiction. And the examples of what would be Germany, Belgium, and Spain. The last would be intergovernmental collaboration. The sixth feature would be processes and institutions to facilitate intergovernmental collaboration for those areas where governmental responsibilities are shared or inevitably overlap. This intergovernmental collaboration has two important dimensions. Okay. One would be inter-unit relations, relations between constituent governments. And the other would be relations between the federal and unit governments for them to be able to coordinate. If in courts it's about conflict, this one would be in terms of coordination. So, examples at the formal level would be standing and ad hoc meetings involving ministers, prime ministers, and first ministers of constituent governments, legislators, officials, and agencies of different governments. Let's go to the next subsection, primary and secondary characteristics of federalism. Let me share to you a neat institutional design technique to make sense of the institutional features of federalism. I got this from Aaron Lighthart, another winner of Johann Sky Prize, and his classic work, Patterns of Democracy. You have seen the 6 orders discussed by Watts. Some scholars add more. Okay, we mentioned Ivo Dubček. Some other scholars actually add more. You could think of the first 2, according to Aaron Lighthart, as the primary characteristics. And the other features are simply secondary characteristics that make the primary characteristics possible. This is a common institutional design technique in terms of identifying first order rule and second order rule. Let us now go to why and why not federalism. Okay, so before that, why and why not federalism? Because of time constraints, I would only list the advantages and disadvantages of federalism. And I've used, again, the ideas federalism primer because it's very useful. So potential advantages of federalism according to International IDEA. Okay. Federalism is offered as an institutional solution to the problems associated with scale and diversity. Second, federal government is rooted in constitutionalism and pluralism. Third, it broadens the base of power sharing, encourages innovative and pragmatic approaches to policy development. The fifth, it reduces the burden on central authorities. Shares resources across geographical space. And 7, develop capacity and democratic responsibility. In terms of potential disadvantages of federalism, the first one would be duplication of work and lack of coherence. Second, additional operating costs. The third, increasing regional discrepancies of wealth, resources, and outcomes. The fourth would be harmful economic competition between subnational units. The fifth, I already mentioned it earlier, judicialization of politics. The sixth would be potential exclusion of minorities. 7, the strengthening of local elites who misuse power. 8, ineffective governance because of a lack of capacity. And 9, instability and threats to democracy. We now go to the institutional design literature, and I will be discussing the 3 cautionary insights from the institutional design literature. The first cautionary insight is that there is actually no consensus on the superiority of one form or one system to another. There is no consensus on the superiority of the federal to the unitary system of government, or the parliamentary or the semi-presidential to the presidential form of government, or vice versa. Critics of the superiority argument give two intertwined reasons. The first would be institutional bundle. The term bundle is mine because they use different terms, but I think bundle would be very good, okay, to explain what they mean. Okay. You could think of system of government actually as a package of institutional features. It is a shortcut, okay, for a plethora of institutional features. For example, a federal system of government, okay, and this would be just a few examples, where the performance of a federal system would actually depend on its distribution of legislative executive powers, the manner or type of constitutional entrenchment, the design of the upper house, mechanisms for intergovernmental coordination. Same thing happens with unitary, and I'm just going to mention just a few examples. The performance of a unitary system of government, a particular unitary system of government, would depend on the manner of recruitment in the national local bureaucracy, the appointment powers of the president to the bureaucracy, the level and type of decentralization, as well as the level of type of devolution. Okay. And this would actually be, okay, one principle of institutional design: the devil is in the details. Taken together, at the level of institutional bundle, this insight helps explain performance. The same thing happens, okay, in the form of government. You could also think of it as a package of institutional features, okay, where in the parliamentary form, its performance would depend on a number of features. And just a few examples would be the type of confidence vote, dissolution power of the Prime Minister, the design of the legislature, whether it's unicameral, bicameral, the power of the legislative committees in a parliamentary form, and the cabinet powers, okay, of the government. Same thing with presidential. Again, just a few examples. The performance would depend on veto power of the president, legislative proactive powers of the president, impeachment rules, impoundment and other budgetary powers, or re-election rule. And again, the same principle is that the performance would depend on the details of the institutional features there. So we have this devil is in the details. Okay, same thing, at the level of institutional bundle, this insight helps explain performance. We now go to the second one, a more popular term. This one is the actual term in institutional design, institutional configuration. This is about how different types of institutions affect each other. Okay? For example, how a party system is affected by the electoral system. The important insight here is that this means that institutions must not be analyzed independently from other institutions that may affect their functioning. I have diagrammed this in this way: a form of government, the performance will be affected by other institutions. Okay? For example, parliamentary form of government, just one pair of example, its performance would be affected by the party system, which in turn is affected by the electoral system. For example, whether the election of the parliament would be single-member district, it's going to be majoritarian, and we call that type of parliamentary form a Westminster form of government, okay? Or PR, or mixed member. Same thing with presidential form of government. You have the party system and the electoral system. In a presidential form of government, of course, we talk about how the legislature and the president is elected. Okay. So you have the SMD, single member district, proportional representation, runoff, whether the president is actually declared winner, if he has any majority of vote or any majority of vote, the timing of elections, and again, the devil is in the details argument here. So at the level of institutional configuration, okay, or institutional design, this insight helps explain performance. Same thing with the system of government, you have the same argument there. Note that non-institutional factors that are not yet factored here: the level of economic development, colonial heritage, very important, British colonial heritage, political culture, political elite composition, length of democracy, and geographical location, wherein a competent or a very good institutional design framework would also include the interaction between non-institutional and institutional factors. We now go to the second cautionary insights: reform, not overhaul. The recommendation of top scholars for democratic countries with already functioning systems or forms of government is actually to reform rather than overhaul their systems or forms of government. Okay? The revival of institutional design questions actually is linked with the most recent wave of democratization, wherein from 1974 to 1994, about 75 countries transited to democracies, including the Philippines in 1986. Okay? These institutional design questions involve fundamental institutional choices for new democracies, the most important of which is the form of government. And this was actually ushered in by the important role of Juan Lin's 1990 article, The Perils of Presidentialism, which was a devastating critique on the presidential form of government. We have the work, the 1990 work of Juan Lin's. This article would be picked up by Filipino parliamentary advocates by mid-1990s, when ironically, we have already made our choice of form of government in the 1987 Constitution. These new democracies, these regimes in transition actually have no option but to make these constitutional choices. The difficulty and danger of these choices are captured by the subtitle of Jon Elster's book on post-communist transitions in Eastern Europe. And this would be Institutional Design in Post-Communist Societies. The subtitle is Rebuilding the Ship at Sea. So even for most scholars arguing the superiority of parliamentary and or federal, there is no recommendation to dump existing presidential or unitary system. It is more a scholarly debate. Okay? Very, very few scholars, and they're not the prominent ones who actually advocate that you dump your existing form or system of government if you already have one under democratic conditions. The analogy that I have here is like Sagada in Manila. You might talk of Sagada, how beautiful Sagada is, how fresh the air is, how great the zoning, and you complain about Manila, okay, how congested, how the air is so polluted. But it's very different to say that we have to restructure Manila according to Sagada. Okay. In terms of overhaul, among the reasons why strongly discouraged, the first one is, for some scholars, it's unnecessary. If there is no superiority, then there is no need for overhaul. The second one is that it is unbelievable. The tasks are too institutionally and intellectually complex for the lofty goals that are mentioned. Okay? Institutionally, okay, we talk about institutional bundle in order to make it work, plus institutional configuration. Institutional, especially for federalism, where state governments, state constitutions, courts and bureaucracy, etc., would have to be created. And in the Philippines, the time frame for some of the advocates would be for 10 years. For one whole decade, the institutional architecture of the country would be in limbo. And taking time frames 10 years. And in this country, we're not even saying or. It's actually in. And this is something even more difficult to comprehend because no democratic country has been crazy enough to make these overhauls at the same time. That is why you could not find any literature discussing this, which means we are on our own. Okay. It's already frowned upon if it's just one of the two, but we're going to do this, okay, both at the same time. Okay. Just when you think it could not get crazier, okay, in the State of Nation of the new president, okay, from out of the blue, he talks about semi-presidentialism. Semi-presidentialism with its dual executive and one of the most difficult veto-gates, okay, of the executive. And it is fast becoming a grocery list of institutions now. Second, we go to that intellectually complex. The institutional design literature has actually sobered from the enthusiasm of the early 1990s on the power to get institutional design right. And for those interested in institutional design, I strongly recommend that you read this 2013 article, a reflection piece of many top political scientists who have been involved advising governments in revising just their electoral system. It's not even form of government nor system of government, just their electoral system. One aspect of the institutional configuration electoral system, and you will see there a lot of reflection on how theoretical predictions on electoral system did not follow those theoretical predictions. So in this context, the Philippines Constitutional Overall Project in 2016, it seems like a height of intellectual irony. Where are we going to get the scholarship to guide us? In this context, is it hubris or simple sheer ignorance of the literature? And the lofty goals. I'm going to show you one of the most prominent advocates of federalism under Gloria Arroyo. Some advantages of federalism, parliamentary government for the Philippines. It's very popular, it's shared, it is quoted by websites on federalism, this work. And I'm going to share to you just three of the advantages of federalism that he lists. Advantages of the proposed federalist republic, according to Dr. Bueva, who's a political science professor from our department, and also from the College of Public Administration, and also a former president of the University of the Philippines. The third one would be the Federal Republic will empower our citizens by enabling them to raise their standard of living and enhance their political awareness through their participation and efficacy in elections and the making and carrying out of government decisions at the regional and local levels. Number 4, the Federal Republic will improve governance by challenging and energizing state and local leaders, entrepreneurs, citizens around the country to take hold of their destiny. Federalism will release them from the costly, time-consuming, stifling, and demoralizing effects of excessive central government controls and regulation in our traditional unitary system. And another one would be the Federal Republic will thus stimulate and hasten the country's political, economic, social, and cultural development. Okay. The best assessment of the literature on the federal system in the Philippines, or outputs of advocates of Filipino advocates of federalism, still is the article found in this book, Federalism in Asia, published in 2007. I highly recommend the professor from Australian National University, Ronald May. His article is Federalism versus Autonomy in the Philippines, where he gets to review the literature. In the conclusion, he mentions that that the advantages claimed for federal over unitary systems read more like statements of faith than reasoned arguments. Okay, this is the assessment of the Australian scholar. Statements of faith than reasoned arguments. And if it's correct, we're going to change our constitution based on faith, okay, not on arguments. After 11 years, I think things change. Well, one could use the article of former Senate President Ongpin, where he argues that federalization is not a panacea. But if you read the article, it may not be a panacea, but it sounds like one, or very close to one. For example, okay, let's take this one paragraph. Okay. According to President Ongpin, for the proponents are aware that federalization is not a panacea. What is simply suggested is that properly refined, please take note of that term, properly refined, because in institutional design, there's no such thing as properly refined. You could never get the design right. Okay, that's the first basic insight of institutional design when you do political economy. The federal system will actually expand to the fullest extent possible the people's power and authority to chart the course of their own destiny. For one reason or another, they're attracted to the word destiny, short of granting them full independence in the respective federal states. In order to assess this, I recommend strongly the book by a political science professor, an American political professor, Daniel Treisman, The Architecture of Government, which actually reviews the literature on federalism, not on the Philippines, actually not on the Philippines, but the scholarly literature on federalism and decentralization. Professor Treisman quotes the work of two Pol Sci professors, Jan Eric Lane and Svante Ersson, the riddle of federalism. Does federalism impact on democracy? Because federalism project here in the Philippines is being sold as it's going to improve democracy because local government would be enhanced. At the local level, you would have more democracy. It's more powerful because people would know at the local level what are their democratic needs. This work actually reviews a number of cases of democratic, unitary, and federal democracies and have this conclusion that there is actually no significant difference in democratic performance. But even more, the next work, Constitutional Design and Democratic Performance, by Joe Racker and Todd Ludman, would say that actually unitary systems do better in certain democratic performances. For example, political participation. What is interesting about the federal argument in this country is that they may be right. Democratic performance might improve, but they have never mentioned any evidence for their proof. I've been watching YouTube articles. I have to mention this. Another excellent article is Eric Wibble's in the Annual Review of Political Science, which reviews the literature on federalism. Same argument, no significant difference in democratic performance between federal and unitary systems. I've been watching YouTube channels, videos on federalism. The same argument would be given, but unfortunately, no evidence yet on superior democratic performance. Then lofty goals for the two German political science professors. These lofty goals are identified as hyper-rationality in institutional design. Hyper-rationality is the belief that just because you change rules, you're actually going to change a politician's behavior. That's hyper-rationality. In my classes, I call it this assumption hyper-institutionalism. I teach an institutional design course. In fact, I have 3 students here. I tried to sell to them the power of institutional design. Okay? But then also emphasize to them the limit of institutional design. And that's hyper-institutionalism. We quote Rain Padepara, one of the most important scholars on electoral system design. He warns us that, this is a major work, designing electoral rules and waiting for an electoral system to evolve. He warns us that excessive optimism in institutional design easily leads to excessive disillusionment afterwards and can be very dangerous for a democracy. And this is now my argument, because it could undermine rather than deepen your democracy, and may set it up, ironically, for an authoritarian challenge later on. Because one could argue that we have already tried everything under democracy, and perhaps we should change our regime itself. The third one would be unsafe, highly risky, and it will be discussed in Cautionary Insight number 3. So we return. The emphasis of the scholars would be reform. Let's make it into a noun and make it plural. Reforms. Reforms do not need constitutional revisions, only legislation, and if there will be a need for constitutional tinkering, it would just be constitutional amendments. This is preferred by scholars because it is more justifiable. We have 2 reform principles from Larry Diamond. And this is the classic work of Larry Diamond, Developing Democracy. And I'm happy that I have a sociologist this time around, not a political scientist, but he also teaches in the political science department of Stanford University, one of the most major democratic theorists, and a shoo-in later for a Johann Skytte Prize. Larry Diamond. I borrowed 2 reform principles from Larry Diamond. He talks about this in terms of reforming your electoral system. The first principle is that reform only in the face of manifest flaws. Why is it very important? When you talk of manifest flaws, it is already manifest, which means that there is already a social coalition, some kind of consensus backing up this reform. It need not be universal consensus, but you could identify in certain sectors of the society, academia, civil society, politicians, yes, we have a problem here, and we could intervene. And second, reform should correct those flaws as specifically as possible. He warns us of overcorrecting an institutional design. In fact, if you want to be really conservative, some scholars would say, live with the errors or the weaknesses, because you might be better with the devil you know than the devil you do not know. And it is also less risky. Messed up reforms are more reformable. And if there are errors in the reforms, it is easier to return to the old setup or to push it further to the new setup, to new legislation or amendment. Thus, piecemeal reforms that move to a more parliamentary-like direction, if you're a fan of a parliamentary form. For example, party system reforms against turncoatism. Or if you're a fan of federalism, more federal-like direction. For example, increased regional autonomy or more robust local government code involve only legislation, not constitutional amendment. These party system reforms are actually very important in institutional design because for many scholars may yet be the most crucial prerequisite before any talk of a constitutional shift to a parliamentary form. In fact, the newer literature on federalism is also talking like this. I just did not have time to incorporate anymore. Before you have talk of any shift to federalism, you actually have to address reforms of your party system. According to Sartori, a major political scientist, in his work, Neither Presidentialism Nor Parliamentarism, undisciplined political parties in a presidential democracy becoming disciplined in a parliamentary shift is, according to him, against all odds. Okay. Remember, he's a winner of Johannes Kite and a major, a political science professor. We have Mainwaring and Sugar, another pair of major political scientists in their work, Presidentialism and Democracy in Latin America, rethinking the terms of the debate, which partly is a response to the article of Juan Linz, argues that undisciplined political parties in a parliamentaryship could actually exacerbate problems of governability and instability more than in a presidential democracy, and may pose a bigger problem than in a presidential democracy. We have already met Croissant and Merkel. For them, it's a problem of time horizon. Okay? A difference in time horizon. Okay? Constitutions are written down. They're formal. They're easy to write down. You could write them down in one day. But to change behavior, that's something else. At times it takes months, years, even decades. So the consolidation of the new party system takes much longer than changing the constitution. According to them, old, fragmented, clientelistic, and irresponsible parties would not be able to create strong and stable governments, such that your problem when you make the shift is actually government stability itself, not just inefficient policy making. When you talk of overhaul, this would be very different from messed up constitutional revisions involving system or form of government, especially for shift to federalism. Because as we have already discussed, shift to federalism, because of constitutional entrenchment protecting its status, no federal country negotiated under democratic constitutions has ever returned to unitary. This is an argument of a pro-federal scholar, Nancy Bermejo, in her important article, Import of Institutions. No country has ever returned, no federal country has ever returned, when its federalism must be negotiated under democratic conditions. Those who do are called, they are under the forced together federalism. These are countries wherein they became federal under colonial or non-democratic conditions. The concept of forced together federalism. Okay, we're now in the third cautionary insight. Okay, institutional design is political design. Okay. According to Adam Dvorsky, in his important work, Sustainable Democracy, together with other political scientists and social scientists, there are no optimal democratic institutions. So we could diagram this, no such thing as an optimal democratic institution. And even if there were, the distributive impact of institutional design means opposing political forces will most likely not choose them. So, in this context, we could think of the old condition as A, then you have B1, the choice could be B2 or B3, wherein they're moving because of the choices or the dynamics of opposing political forces. The most important actors are those who will write the Constitution. Of course, there are other actors, but the most important are the ones who are there to write the Constitution. And each institutional design outcome reflects the balance of power. We could think of this as one way of understanding the political economy of institutional design or constitutional engineering. We could now go to the political economy of the Federalism project in the Philippines under Duterte. The Federalism project in the Philippines under Duterte is different from the Federalism project before Duterte, 1986, early 2016. Only president to support was Gloria Arroyo. In her campaign platform in 2004, Federalism was included, but once she became president, she only gave haphazard support. The consultative commission she appointed came up with a proposed revision of the 1987 Constitution, but federalism was just relegated to to the transitory provisions, Section 15 and Section 16. And only played second fiddle to the parliamentary project. But under Duterte, you have very strong support of the president, prominent in his campaign platform, and a clear primacy over the parliamentary, now semi-presidency project. So we discussed, U represents unitary, F represents federal, P, blue, would be parliamentary or semi-parliamentary. The question in the political economy perspective is how do we reach here? Okay, so even if we concede that there's such a thing as an optimal federal federal system of government, the question is, how do we get there? And that's the political economy question. The current preferred mode of the Philippine president, the House Speaker, the Senate President, is the Constituent Assembly. And in fact, the House Committee on Constitutional Amendment, I think about 2 weeks ago, already passed the CONAS, the Constituent Assembly, a concurrent resolution calling for a Constituent Assembly. Constituent Assembly, I discussed this in class, is in Article 17 Amendments or Revision, is actually here, wherein upon a vote of 3/4, that would be the Constituent Assembly of the Congress, upon a vote of 3/4 of all its members. And I will tell my students that the term never appears in the Constitution. There's actually a question on the Congress, shall it vote separately or jointly? I'll try to explain what happened in the Constitutional Commission, but we have an expert here who could actually explain it better. It's because the section on amendments or revision was actually resolved early. In fact, July 9, 1986. An assumption it's going to be unicameral. But unexpectedly, on July 21, 1986, the vote was for a bicameral Congress by a margin of 1 vote, 23 versus 22. When the Committee on Style met on October 10, which was a Friday night, they missed out on the Congress, although they revised certain words there. If you read, the head of the committee was Commissioner Rodrigo. If you read a few more lines after this, dinner was served. It was already 8:20. So probably they were so tired, and dinner was waiting, and they missed out the Congress part. But I agree with the interpretation. It's a stylistic one. It was meant to follow the 1935 Constitution, which was, of course, separately voting. But for now, it is not an issue because there's an agreement for now with Congress. They may vote separately in CONAS. Assuming that the Duterte administration could get the 3/4 vote, which is a very high vote, it's a supermajority, a strong supermajority, 1824 in the Senate, which is still a big question mark. If you ask me, I don't think that they have the numbers, but it's going to be a close vote. But when it comes to the lower house, they need 223, 297. I think it's sure ball because of the nature of the lower house. So we could go to Philippine Congress, especially we now have to discuss the nature of the Congress that will become a Constituent Assembly. And I have only 2 comments. The first one is the very low level of institutionalization of political parties in our Congress, especially the lower house. In fact, we have one of the lowest. There are many ways in the political science discipline to make sense of institutionalization. One of them, in fact, one of the most thematic would be party switching, which is, of course, that you abandon your party for the winning party. It's one of the most dramatic and one of the worst forms of a party deinstitutionalization. Let us discuss the current 17th Congress, the one that will become the CONAS. The election result for the lower house, PDP Laban only had 3 out of 297 representatives. LP had 116 members. Okay. Post-election party switching and realignment, PDP Laban membership and allies swelled to a supermajority of 260 plus. Okay. The official minority is 20 plus, okay, but also functions as the majority's minority. Okay, and at times it's actually more majority than the majority. And the real minority, okay, from 8 is now down to 7. Okay. As of now, it is an overwhelmingly pro-administration coalition. It's well known in the literature what would be the effects, higher level of chaos to move legislative agenda of the executive, which means fourth barrel by any other name. Okay, this would be the CDF, PDAF, DAF, and now Duterte's fourth. There's still no name for the 80 million pesos. Okay. And then you would have more incoherent lawmaking as more policy side payments. The first one would be about patronage money. The other would be what's the effect on your legislation. Policy side payments are made with more players representing particularistic interests, okay, and more unstable political support for the president, especially when his popularity starts to go down and is abandoned by the party supporting him. The second comment would be the high level of barrier to entry. And one of the most crucial indicators, and again, we're one of the most efficient, prominent here, would be the role of political dynasty. I'm not aware of any scholarly study yet on the 16th Congress, 2013-2016, and the current 17th Congress, 2016-2019. But there are at least 2 on the House of Representatives of the 15th Congress, 2010-2013. Unfortunately, Dean Mendoza cannot join us because it's this article that I will be discussing together with other Ateneo professors. This is his important work published in the Political Science Journal, Inequality and Democracy, Insights from an Empirical Analysis of Political Dynasties in the Philippines. According to this article, 70% of members actually belong to a political dynasty, defined as, quote-unquote, with kinship links, that is one legislator in the 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th Congress, or at least one local government official elected in 2001, 2004, 2007, or 2010. This is their dynasty tree type. There are 4 types. Okay? 70% are members of a political dynasty. If we go to another work by my colleague, Dr. Temari Rivera, published in 2011, in Search of Credible Elections and Parties, the Philippine Paradox. According to their study, 34 out of 77 provinces, or almost half, had the same political family winning the governorship in at least one congressional district. It's about intensity of power, okay, because it identifies a governor actually controlling the province with one congressional district as relative, or one occupying that congressional district as a relative. And this is their work, and this is their table, okay, 1 to 34. 44% of provinces there. You might notice with Ilocos Norte, okay, Quirino, and Iloilo, they also have senators as relatives. Okay. So number 1, number 8, and number 17. This high level of barrier to entry, the pernicious effects are well known in political science. They're self-perpetuating in politics by nature of clan replication. Fathers beget sons, sons beget grandsons for the first father. Second, this would be the argument of anarchy of families also by Alfred McCoy, as well as PCIJ's rule makers. Second would be highly clientelistic, patronage-based, because familial clan interests take precedence over national interests. And the third one is that, of course, it prevents party institutionalization, because dynasties in this country act as surrogates of political parties. Okay. So, we start with this political economy diagram with CONAS members who are winners of the old unitary presidential setup. And we're going to use the arguments of Haggard and Kaufman in this first part of the section. These CONAS members we know are overwhelmingly for non-institutionalized and dynastic interests. This would be compromises with groups that have benefited from existing institutional arrangements. The CONAS would be composed of people who actually benefit from the current arrangement. In this context, the assumption is you're not going to get the optimal outcome. You're going to get at least F1 or PSP1 representing the form of government. Each institutional design outcome reflects the balance of power. But the balance of power in this case is overwhelmingly for those who benefit from the old unitary and presidential setup. So the swing can actually be dramatic. And we could have not F1, but actually F2. But according to the scholars, if we're going to expand the argument, because of the sheer multiplicity of features involved, think institutional bundle and configuration, you could actually end up with F3, which for the scholars could represent hybrid outcomes that leave lines of accountability unclear and combine the worst of both worlds. Which I call in an article of mine, I call institutional Frankenstein or Frankenstein outcomes. These CONAS members or winners of the old unitary presidential setup would represent institutional endogeneity. Institutional design basically talks about the power of institutions, but it also talks about institutional endogeneity, which is about why do we have why do we make these institutional choices? What explains institutional choices? Or what explains institutional performance? Among the most important factors of institutional endogeneity are these existing vested interests. That is why in democratization literature, there's actually a premium on democratic regime transitions. Why? Because the assumption is some kind of displacement of the vested interests of the old order happened, at least at the political level. That's why, by definition, you're having a regime transition. This vested interest, again, would be those who benefit from the old setup. This is actually the worst case scenario of constitution making for Adam Dvorsky in his truly classic work, Democracy and Market, published in 1989. According to him, when the relation of forces is known and uneven, the institutions are actually custom-made for a particular person, party, or alliance. Jon Elster, in the same work that we encountered earlier, constitutions ought to be written by specially convened assemblies, not by bodies that also serve as ordinary legislatures. The reason being, in order to reduce the scope of institutional interests. Meaning that the very best of political science says, don't do constituent assemblies that are legislative assemblies. Okay? Go for something more democratic if you're crazy enough to actually change your form or system. So in this context, that's the CONAS members there. So the political economy of the Federalism project in the Philippines under Duterte would be looking like this. My analogy is that the same inept driver who actually has bumped your car a number of times in Manila, don't think that just because you bought a brand new vehicle, he would successfully actually bring you to Sagada. It's the same old driver driving a new vehicle, and you think that you're going to be safe in your trip from Manila to Sagada when he couldn't even drive from one street to another in Manila. we're almost done. The other cautionary insights I've just mentioned, I will not discuss, promise. Okay. Very important, okay, for those who are interested in institutional design as misdesign, which is very known in the literature as strategic miscalculation of actors. Yes, they may act on their self-interest, but they may get their self-interest incorrect. This is the law of unintended consequences in institutional design. And the principle is, the more you tinker, the higher the possibility that you're going to commit errors. And number 5 would be from Jon Elster, institutional design as designless. Meaning that there's an upstream and downstream quality of new constitutional choices. Upstream would be the constitutional making. Downstream would be the interpretation of these constitutional provisions. The push and pull of the Supreme Court and the push and pull of executive and legislative or competing executives on what these provisions mean. And they take a long time, and they could be tortuous, and in that context, they actually would determine how these institutions work. In the words of Rein Tagatera, that's when you have electoral rules become electoral systems. And I think we're done. Thank you very much.